In this video, we'll be looking at the work of the Royal Army Medical Corps field ambulances in the Great War. During the First World War, over 2 million British soldiers were to be wounded, and their treatment was provided by the Royal Army Medical Corps, which was the equivalent of the NHS for the British Army. And many of us know this from family relatives, such as the guy pictured here is a relative of mine who was wounded, and in fact, looking at the lower left-hand side of his arm, we can see two stripes there that denote the fact he was actually wounded twice. So the medical services of the British Army were able to treat and return to duty many soldiers. And whilst much has been written about the work of regimental medical officers and of nurses and of surgical procedures, not much has been written about the medical service that got people from the point of wounding on the battlefield to that surgery. And this was predominantly the work of the Royal Army Medical Corps Field Ambulance. Now, the Field Ambulance was born out of the experience of the South African War of 1899 to 1902. And during this period, the Royal Army Medical Corps, or the RAMC as I'll call them from now on, gained valuable medical experience in the treatment of ballistic injuries caused by the new munitions and weapon systems. But post-war it was criticised for the performance and the structure of its field units. The individual role and collective relationships of the RAMC field units had been judged wanting, the resulting delays in movement down the line contributing to a higher mortality rate. In an organisation looking for change, it's perhaps surprising that it was left to a territorial force staff sergeant to put forward the solution. He suggested an amalgamation of an existing bearer company and field hospital into one unit. This simple idea was well received, and with backing from the higher echelons of the Army Medical Services, and only minor refinements provided the blueprint for the field ambulance. So what is a field ambulance? Well, the RAMC Training Manual, issued in 1911, which I'll probably refer to as RAMC 1911 from now on to shorten this, provides an insight into the expected role of the field ambulance during deployments. With a nominal strength of 10 officers and 224 other ranks, the field ambulances of an infantry division, commanded by a lieutenant colonel, each contained 3 sections. Each section, A, B and C, were actually then subdivided into 2 further sections, a bearer section and a tent section. Now, the bearer section was 1 officer and 42 other ranks, was responsible for the removal of casualties from the front line and the resupply of the medical officer in the front line. The tent subdivision, which was 2 officers and 20 other ranks, would reassess the casualty, begin any necessary treatment and provide shelter and comfort whilst awaiting evacuation down the line. It was in turn responsible for resupplying the bearer subdivision, and that's a general principle with the medical services, that the unit resupplies the unit in front of it. Each section had a transport element attached of an NCO and 9 or 10 other ranks of the Army Service Corps. And there was a batman for each officer, or sort of orderly as they're sometimes referred to, or a servant as you may have heard it referred to. And there was also an additional Army Service Corps driver for the cook's wagon, and that completed the unit. The 3-section structure had been chosen to provide flexibility in deployment, allowing the detachment of a section to provide support to distant subunits of the division. The expectation, at least in the Army Medical Services, was for future operations to be the same small-scale deployments required in policing an empire. And what we see here is a picture, and it's one I've put together based on the chain of evacuation as laid out in the 1911 manual that we talked about earlier. So from the point of wounding, the soldier, if able, would move himself towards the Regimental Aid Post, the RAP. Stretcher bearers, normally found from within the regiment, would collect or assist those unable to move themselves. In this RAP, the wounded man would meet the RAMC's first representative. This was the Regimental Medical Officer, and that's the RMO. You know, militaries like their acronyms. And this RMO was responsible for the immediate treatment and prioritisation for evacuation. They concentrated on the arrest of bleeding, dressing of wounds, and the relief of pain. Now, the range of equipment held by the Regimental Aid Post was necessarily limited due to its requirement for mobility. However, during the First World War, periods of trench holding might allow an accumulation of equipment, but the treatment options following a successful assault would be very restricted. As soon as possible, the bearer sections from the field ambulance would move forward, working in squads of typically 4 to a stretcher, and they would remove any immobile casualties back from the Regimental Aid Post. Explicit in the 1911 manual is instructions for the need for the bearer division to be in touch with the Regimental Aid Post and evacuate from this point first. Only once the Regimental Aid Post is clear of casualties should the bearer squad search this surrounding area for further casualties. The bearers would move the casualty back towards the dressing stations, marked here on our picture, and this is where possible they'd be handed over to an ambulance wagon. This is probably one of the preconceptions or misconceptions, is that an RAMC field ambulance isn't actually referring to the vehicles as an ambulance, it was a unit. Now, it was expected that one bearer squad should be able to attend to, i.e. get to, and patch up, and bring back a wounded man and carry him back 1 mile, hand him over, and return themselves to their point of duty within 1 hour. A tent subdivision would form a dressing station, and again there's clear guidelines for the officer commanding. It should be as far forward as possible, depending on enemy action and the terrain, accessible to wheeled vehicles but clear of roads required for fighting troops, protected from gun and rifle fire, and proximity to artillery positions should be avoided. Though they weren't to know this at the time, but on the crowded battlefields of Flanders, much of the above would often be proved to be impossible to follow. The dressing station was organised to receive, classify and record casualties. Individual departments for the severely and slightly injured were to be established. We have another one for the dying. The arrival, treatment and departure of the wounded would be documented at the dressing station. The importance of this was emphasised in the 1911 manual. Now, of particular concern was the treatment of abdominal injuries. The RAMC policy of avoidance of both surgery and movement would be at odds with the required mobility of the field ambulance, and this would be a problem particularly during the open warfare that characterised the early and later stages of the war. So if that was the plan for the Royal Army Medical Corps field ambulances and how they would work in warfare, how did that stand up to the actual realities of the First World War? And in the next episode, we will look at what happened in 1914 and how the RAMC field ambulances responded to the demands of the battles of Mons, Le Cateau, the retreat to the Marne, etc.